I'll just turn it over to Laura Lowrey, a forest entomologist with the Forest Service out of their Southern Oregon Service Center. And she's going to be talking about true firs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Laura. And
okay.
Sarah will be changing the slides on your command, I believe.
Yep, just let me know when you're ready for the next slide, Laura, and I'll advance us along.
Thank
you.
I
don't see, let's see, I don't see, okay, let's try it out. Can you advance it and see if it was working on my end one time?
Okay, are you able to see the second slide here, your intro slide?
No, let's see. Oh, okay. Yes, I got it. Okay. Got it. All right, let's do this. Thank you all for your patience. This better be worth it, right? I've waited this long, but I'll try to do my best to educate and entertain. I'm here in my shop. I was telling Glenn and Sarah that we don't have AC, so it's a little bit hot. So I'm hearkening how the trees feel after these hot summers. And with that in mind, let's get started. You can go to the second slide. Okay, yeah, I'm Laura Lowrey. I'm an entomologist down in Southwest Oregon. I work for Forest Health Protection, and I'm here to talk about true fir dying in Oregon, or the elevated mortality that we've been hearing about. And that's quite a loaded question. So I have a lot to talk about, and I'm pretty excited to do it. Sarah, you can go to the next slide. I'll just say next. This is just a slide to show all the Forest Health Protection service centers in Oregon. There are 3 other service centers and also a service center in Washington. And we cover all federal lands. So that's BLM, Forest Service, and other federal partners and recognized tribes. And I have a work partner, Josh Bronson, who's our pathologist. So what I'm going to discuss would be the trends of the true fir dying, and then some of the whys and some of the impacts we can expect as we talk about the forest readjusting. Next. Before we get started even further, I'll just thank the aerial detection survey team in Region 6. And they provided quite a number of trend slides that I'll show today, and they're always a great big help of providing that larger perspective when we're talking about tree health and insect and disease population dynamics. Next. Here, this slide shows a bunch of the clips from some of the articles that were put out by different media over the year, and you can see how they really like the term Firmageddon. And so we're going to talk about how sort of why we got that name, just because of the elevated mortality and how extensive it really was. And so let's go to the next slide and we'll dig into that a little bit. And here's a picture of the elevated fir mortality shown from Central Oregon. And this same level of mortality or similar extended in parts of Northeast Oregon as well, and down in Southwest Oregon to the California border, but it didn't stop there. It went through, and there's portions of California, and for elevated fir mortality was also described in other places in the West last year as well. Next slide. Here we show different ranges of several of our true fir species. I think I missed a couple of them, but you have the subalpine fir in the Cascades dominating or range through there. White fir in the Siskiyou Mountains, a little bit in the Cascades. Pacific silver in the Cascade Mountain Range, and red fir in the Siskiyous, Cascades, a little bit, and a lot in the California, and grand fir out on the coastal range and Central Oregon. Next slide. Why are we concerned about true fir dying at all? Besides being aware that it's an important timber species, and it is, that we think of true fur as important for our sensitive species like salmonoids and other mammals and all kinds of animals and fish. And we think about hydrological health in our watersheds for that snowpack retention we depend on, and just other needs of other reasons why it's important for hydrological health. It's really important for recreation too. We think of the West, it's quite iconic in some places that having true fur at our favorite campsites and our mountaintops and where we ski. I love to ski, so I really love to see true fur growing in my ski areas. And true fur colonizes some areas also where other species do not, and they're really good at colonizing. We'll talk more about that. Next slide. So true fur decline and mortality has ebbed and flowed over the decades, but over the last several years, we've had a really big an uptick of the questions from the public at the front desks and in social media, asking about the dead trees. We've had actual timber sale contracts that are being disrupted due to the number of the dead volume in the sale, and that's been becoming more widespread in different parts of Oregon. We've had a more hazard tree workload along our roads and our recreation sites, and definitely concerns over fuel loading for our large trees in our high priority areas that are at risk for living too near the dying trees. And of course, that Fermageddon phrase really caught hold and went around. So next slide. To begin with, digging in when we began to see the true fur, we first captured a lot of the information through aerial survey. And we have this wonderful aerial survey effort that happens every year. And it's a coordinated effort between the Forest Service and Oregon Department of Forestry and Washington Department of Natural Resources. They fly all federal lands, and we have you have just literally seconds. They're flying from fixed wing aircraft, and we're using digital sketch mappers, and you have a couple seconds to record, hey, that tree's not healthy. What tree is it? What killed it? And how bad is it? And I do the survey. I help with part of the survey in Southwest Oregon. Next slide. Here we have a graph showing historical numbers of fur engraver going back all the way to 1952. So it's on the left is 1952 and on the right is 2002. And the blue bars are Oregon fur engraver acres recorded with mortality, and the orange would be fur engraver in Washington state. So we could see over time there have been blips of the populations going up and down, but way on that 2022, and on the right side, we see quite a big jump of mortality caused by the fur engraver. Next slide. Here's a spatial look at the aerial detection survey data showing by color the damage levels across Oregon from last year's 2022 survey. So the yellow are the less damaged acres, and then the purple, red and purple are the more heavily damaged areas. So it isn't, you can really see that it's not just one spot, and it really was extensive in these places across Oregon. Next slide. Let's dig in a little bit about some of the whys of this mortality event and think about the amount of true fur in the forest. So we'll tell a little story about historically, most forests across Oregon were dominated by large diameter pine and trees, and around 1910, that early 1900s, early in the century, fire exclusion started, and it also coincided with a wetter and cooler period that allowed true fur to colonize areas of their range that were a bit drier than they would be in on average. And so we already talked about how the true fur are good colonizers and they have the ability to keep growing. But when they had this time of wet and cooler weather, and then water end is sort of shutting off, or we're getting less precipitation and the temperatures are getting hotter. So those areas of the dry site we can think that they're now not used to that and they can't really handle being so dry. And so we're having this underlying condition of these trees that are not quite cut out for growing where they are anymore. And so this picture, this cartoon is really, imagine the mountain, and this is representing more my area, but it applies, the general idea applies elsewhere in Oregon, that the higher, we have the higher part of the mountain, the alpine, and the subalpine zone starts, we're represented by the mountain hemlock, and here Shasta fir, but it could be subalpine fir, Pacific silver fir. And then mid-mountain area would be the white fir, grand fir, and then lower Douglas fir into the pine and incense cedars, and finally oaks and some other hardwoods. And so in that wetter time, you could see that some of the, or imagine that the grand fir, white fir were coming down into more of the Douglas fir zone, and the Shastas maybe were coming into more of the white fir zone, and now they're having to back up. But there was, and we can also use this picture to think about that the true fir growing at in the subalpine zone up in those above 7,500 feet or 6,000 or approaching that, they've been declining for a while, like a couple decades. Where well, I'll show some information about that coming up, but their crowns have been declining, and there's been studies about that. But these other fir, the lower in the mid-mountain, we're not quite sure if they've been experiencing everywhere that I showed you spatially, where the red and purple were in the previous picture. We're not sure that their crowns were all declining at the same level. So we're really thinking like it's a sort of a different event, that we have this, it's hard growing at the top of the mountains, and these trees that grew up high on the southwest facing aspects were declining for a while, but these other trees, this has been more rapid. Next slide. And here we have a list on the left of species, and this is my area, but it applies to other areas of Oregon. We could substitute in other species, but it's a representation of moisture stress or drought tolerance from higher at the top where we have oaks that are very drought tolerant, down to lower tolerance. We have our firs and hemlocks. And so I also did some reading about some of the other ecophysiological traits that have been published about true fir, how they just are inefficient with water use, and they tend to stay they keep their little openings in the leaves, the stomata, open for longer than they should when it gets hotter, and they don't shut down as quickly, and they're really more inefficient at using the water in their systems anyway, and they have less food available for growth, defense, water and food available for growth, defense, and repair than, for example, spruce that could be occurring in like a traditional mixed spruce fir forest. And so this inefficiency is not entirely consistent with the tendency of fir to occur at slightly lower, warmer sites. But when you think about what we just talked about, well, maybe they were able to colonize these drier areas, even though they weren't so good. They're not really cut out to handle them for the long term. So that's more of the interesting ecophysiology of what's happening in that true fir inside the tree. Next. Some basic definitions, more factors contributing to tree mortality, the chronic hot droughts. Droughts are a meteorological occurrence defined as a period with little or no rainfall of sufficient duration to cause depletion of the soil moisture and reduction of plant growth. And then if you think about another definition of climate, we're talking 30-year expected averages and patterns. When weather we're talking more of like what you actually get each year. So they can sometimes be all confused together. So the picture here shows a publication, is from a publication, Allen et al., 2010. I'm talking about a lot of different trees that we model that are projected to have trouble in a future climate scenario with more mortality, and firs being some of them. Next. Here the picture here shows all of averages across Oregon from 2000 to 2000 on the left to 2023 currently on the right, and that's the drought level. So it's just showing as an average across all of Oregon, but you can see how on the right side we definitely have more of the dark red and brown than in earlier times. And I have this black line drawn down about 2013 was when I checked notes of my colleagues that have retired and left me notes that around 2013, that was the first year that we had hot record-setting temperatures and record-setting drought length. So that really continued the combination of the record-setting temperature and drought pretty much every year since. And some of the other places in Oregon weren't as like they didn't have the record-setting temperatures and droughts starting as early, but about 2016. So you can see it's been happening a long time. These trees are having to deal with this a long time now. Next slide. When there's not enough water, what happens? Well, we get water conducting cells blocked by air bubbles. We get hydrological failure when these water conducting cells collapse for good. And we get the stomata closing too long. And if it happens a lot of years, like I just showed, that could reduce the amount of food produced, which ends up with carbon starvation. So these are two gigantic problems for the tree. And when you have less food available, you have less food for growth, defense, and repair, and you have fewer defensive mechanisms. And so that leads the tree to be more at risk to insects and diseases, or insects and pathogens. Trees can overheat, proteins denature. They go to anaerobic respiration, which is really interesting because alcohols are made, and that's a cue for bark beetles that are signaling to the bark beetles to come attack the trees, basically. So you can see why we have this link to the fir engraver. You get wilting and stunting of features and sometimes death. Next slide. Other factors contributing to tree mortality. I wonder, can you press keep going. They have my slide. Somehow I meant it to come all at once, but in any case, we'll talk about the scenario with the insects and diseases. How do they fit into this whole story? We have predisposing factors. Again, I'm considering dry, marginal sites and density issues with too many trees growing in dry places. And then we get the hot droughts, not annual droughts, hot droughts with the timing that's coinciding when there should be growing, but the trees are shutting down. And the final killers could be thought of as these other abiotic and biotic things. And I'm going to talk about the insects and diseases, but they affect different parts of the tree. They can be problems of the site or in that forest that come and go, or that are there but get worse or better, basically, with the right conditions. They can make damage to a tree quickly or slowly. They can be non-native and native. And we think of these agents as primary agents, insect and disease agents, if they kill the tree and can easily kill green trees, versus secondary agents that are more damaging agents. And then complexes are very common. So there's a mixture of a lot of different critters, think of it that way, in a forest using the tree as host at one time. Next slide. Here's a picture of, back to aerial survey, damaged information. And this one shows on the left from 2000, on the right, 2020. And we have a bunch of different agents, mostly insects that are, well, all insects, except for Cytospora canker, that are a problem for true fir. So the balsam woolly delta is a non-native one, and that's shown in the blue, and it's been around all these years. Cytospora canker is orange, and it has had more acres damaged in that 2006 to 2014, and back to that level was up again in 2022. Dougford tussock moth had some acres damaged in early 2000s, and then they just came out of an outbreak. And that's one of the defoliating insects that cyclically outbreak, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Western spruce budworm in yellow, they also damage the trees and outbreak, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Silver fir beetle and fir engraver are bark beetles. They're usually thought of as primary killers. And fir engraver, you can see that it's been around, but we did have this really big uptick to over 1 million acres damaged. Not every acre, every part of the acre was killed, but over 1 million acres had trees killed within it or trees damaged. Next slide. So we can delve a little bit into the fir engraver bark beetle and how it's contributing to the mortality. So they attack all sizes. So that little beetle, it's very small. My measurement, you can't really see it now, they're just small, smaller than a grain of rice. They're tiny. And they make us, below that is the gallery where they burrow under the bark and use that good tissue, the phloem tissue that conducts sugars up and down, up the tree, sorry, down the tree. And they lay their eggs in a horizontal pattern, and we can tell it's trees are attacked by the fur engraver by that gallery shape. And the right picture shows examples of how the fur engraver can kill trees. It can attack just branches or top kill them, or kill the whole crown at once if there's a whole lot of them. But they are so small, they take like 1,000 in a tree to kill it, or maybe less if this tree is more stressed out. But they attack all the sizes, and they really like large diameter trees, true fir trees. They're beetles, they only need a little bit of area. You can find them historically in areas with average annual precip less than 31 inches. And so that drought fur engraver relationship is quite strong. And also there's a strong relationship with defoliating insects and root disease. Next slide. So we can see that I'll just go over really quickly again, the story that we're bringing forth about the elevated fur mortality then is we have this, a lot of dense true fir growing in a time that was cooler, but now they're in drier sites. And we have these prolonged hot droughts that are signaling to the fur engraver. And we have a lot of really big population of fur engraver around, and they are killing the trees quite quickly. But this year, from the aerial survey, when I flew earlier this in June, and it's looking like some other areas that weren't as bad last year have more fur engraver this year in Southwest Oregon and maybe a little east of the Cascades, and some areas maybe look about the same. So it's ongoing, and we don't see that this year, even that good snowpack didn't really stop things. And we have, and one thing I didn't mention is that heat dome year. We've got a lot of good information about what the heat dome's done to the trees, but think of it as maybe it doesn't have to be such a chronic every many years of hot drought. Maybe there's a year where it's especially bad hot drought for a long period in that growing season, and that is maybe a tipping point for some of these issues to happen within the tree physiologically, letting the beetles respond to this alcohol smell. And so we think of the heat dome has a lot to do with some of that mid-mountain die-off of true fir. Next slide. We'll go into a little bit more information on some of the specific agents. Root diseases. So these pictures show how root disease destroys the root systems of true fir, really shred them. And so you can imagine how when roots look like that, even at lesser degrees, you're not as efficient at conducting water. So they're providing a physiological drought stress within the tree just by having the root diseases in the attacking the tree. And there's several kinds we have laminate, heterobasidian, and armillaria are quite common in Oregon. Different, some prefer other certain species, but we do have information how the fir engraver really does like these root disease attacked infested trees, or yeah, I could say it either way, I guess, but they're associated with root disease. Next slide. Balsamily delgid is a non-native insect, and it's one of the ones I've studied over a long period of my career in the Rockies and here now. And we can see the critters microscopic, very tiny, that little red blob, and they're just such an interesting, odd insect. But they cause all kinds of damage. They cause the swelling of the nodes of the trees. They cause distorted crowns. They cause trees to stop growing because the gouting is too bad. This swelling on the branch nodes gets too bad to grow right or to make seed. So we have this. We know a lot about the balsamily delgid. It's been here a while now, since the 50s, and they kind of killed a lot of trees at first, and now we think they had many that were out on the landscapes had quite a bit of resistance. But for how long? And that's what I'm kind of thinking now is that when we have if they're feeding on the tree, they have a little mouth part that goes into the xylem cells and makes them grow abnormally to be much smaller and thicker walled than they were if they weren't attacked. So they're basically physiologically droughted. And if the different resistance levels leads to different levels of small water conducting cells. But even if they're compromised a little, that might be throw them over the tipping point and make them more, when you combine all the other factors of the chronic hot droughts and make them more susceptible to fur engraver, or just dying on their own from the feeding. So other long-term impacts that are really important are that they can kill in some places, all tree sizes of certain tree, especially subalpine fir. And once they're in the forest, they don't leave. They're there forever. The only thing that really regulates the population would be the resistance or cold. And we're not getting as much of that. So they have potential hydrological impacts and fire behavior impacts, as well as problems for seed recruitment. Next slide. Another important combination of agents would be dwarf mistletoe and Cytospora canker. So the dwarf mistletoe is a parasitic plant that grows on true fir, and it really it makes the tree send its water to where the plant is growing on that part of the crown. So you see the crowns that look really broomy, swollen, have a lot of branches in one place, and then they really provide another entryway for the Cytospora canker, or they kind of work together to provide entryways so the canker pathogen spores go through the needles, into the twigs, through the branches, to the stem of the tree, and then kill the tissue that conducts water on the stem. So this combo also kills, affects the drought, or affects the ability of the true fir to take up water. And not only that, you could have these two things plus root disease plus balsam woolly algae all in the same tree on the same forest, and that's pretty common. So you can see while the fir engravers are finding a nice bit of habitat to come and find these trees that have all these problems. Next slide. Western spruce budworm, I'll just mention really quickly. It's one of our outbreaking insects that every so many years they can outbreak, which means they become more prevalent for many years, for few or even over 10 or 30 years. They are destructive in the caterpillar stage, and they eat the new growth of the tree. So they'll have this red tinge look on the outer side of them. They're more a problem on the eastern side of the state, and not so much on the western side of the Cascades. Next slide. And Douglas fir tussock moth is the final defoliator insect I wanted to talk about, and that one also outbreaks, and which means big populations happen once every decade or so, and they're more of a problem on the eastern side of Oregon, east of the Cascades. They can damage trees they feed on the older foliage, but they can get so bad in drier sites, especially where they damage the new foliage. So they're both of the budworm and the tussock moth really are damaging the photosynthetic tissue that provides the sugar to keep them from going into carbon starvation. And also following these outbreaks, our fir engraver are very common following these outbreaks. So even if they're not killed by the caterpillar, the fir engraver usually kills quite a large percentage of the defoliated trees. Next slide. Wanted to mention, again, go back to how are the high elevation fir forests impacted as climates change. Because as shocking as this elevated mortality is, I do often worry about the high elevation system just being so vulnerable. I have read recently 2 papers that are really great. If you want to check out, the first one I have listed under canopy loss. It goes over 30 years. It's a 30-year analysis in the Klamath Mountains, just south of where I'm working now, looking at different species in the subalpine zone and lower on the mountain, and to see how their canopy decline was faring over the 30 years. And they found that the decline was greatest at the higher elevation, where they're more exposed, thinner soils, southwestern slopes, and they have that old growth structure. And that was completed before this the heat dome events. So and more chronic hot drought. So I wonder what they would have found if they finished their analysis this year or even next year. And the next one is the distribution of the basal area loss, is talked about in a new subalpine fir range-wide population assessment using FIA data. And they're finding that they found that 62% of subalpine fir across the distribution has declined, and attributing a lot of it to they're tracking insect diseases and wildfire, but they're playing together with each other in a way that we're still working on understanding, and how that works and what the roles of climate as a driver in that are. So there's more to learn there for sure, but they also came out with one of their take homes is the fact that if your subalpine fir are declining, then your other conspecifics are likely to decline too. So that means whitebark pine, spruce, and other true fir that are growing up there as well. And so and many more studies in the Rockies or on a smaller scale are indicating similar things, with changes to the precipitation and temperatures are interacting with insects and pathogens and then wildfire to add to the decline of true fir. Next. So how will the latest mortality event affect fire risk and behavior? So we're thinking fuels and fire behavior here. We're thinking that in the short term, some of these agents cause the tree to die quickly, or some that have them stand longer with red needles, like the balsam lily delgid. So some of these trees can stand with these very torchable fuels for a while and can impact crown fire. And then when they fall, they impact the fuel loading, and they can end up burning hotter. The fires can burn hotter and longer in these areas. Both of those things combined can make the fire's severity be in that higher severity level where you end up more like stand replacing, and or thinking like, or I back up and I wanted to say, I usually say we want to have like stand replacing, but not stand erasing. So we don't want to end up with so much hydrophobic soil that you can't get regeneration on their own, or it burns up the seed bank. But that could be what's happening now in some of these hotter fires. We're losing that seed bank, and our soils are being destroyed. Next slide. Really generally, how can you help? I don't want to end so negatively, because we are in this state of, well, Mother Nature is a good friend of mine, retired entomologist Bill Shelb, has said, Mother Nature is cleaning house, and she's not playing favorites. So things are going to look a bit messy for a while till it's figured out. So, and it's not comfortable, right? It's emotional too, and it's scary. So what can we do to help at all? We can thin when times are good, which we're not in a big drought, and maybe in some areas that's not available at the moment. But we can think about also what trees we're planting back, and consider consider different seed sources and that are adapted for ones that are adapted for your soil type in your area. Consider planting Doug fir and pines in some of the areas where, if that makes sense. We can irrigate if we have our landscape trees or our residential trees that we'd like to keep. And if you are watering, just keep it up. Don't shut them off mid-season, and don't fertilize in the middle of it all and put the pressure on for them to grow when they're really struggling already. Next slide. Next one. Oh yeah. So what are we doing about it with the Forest Service? A lot of words up here to say. We're trying. It's complex. We're trying to keep monitoring the situation, but from the air and the ground. We're trying to work on spatial analyses of climate drivers in cooperation with partners to understand what has happened or what we know about, and then how can we use that to predict areas that would be next at risk. But there's a ways to go. We have some work cut out for us, but we're working on clearing roadways, making the roadways and recreation areas safe with all the dying trees. And like I said, there's more work needed for some of these risk analyses to predict and kind of give us a better template of where to work first and how to get ahead of this. And we could use better treatments, recommendations for mechanical and burning treatments. Maybe we can punch some holes in some of these true for homogeneous landscapes with prescribed fire, if we do that in a way that's the right time and everything. So that might be an option for us going forward too. Next slide. Oh, I had mentioned more about, there was one slide that must have got stuck. It was just about fir engraver. And if you have infested trees, it's really hard to see them. That's what the unfortunate part is. They don't have pitch tubes or obvious so show you where they are. They tend to attack higher up on the tree at like 35 feet. So it's hard to really get them out of your area if they're infested, but we're doing our best we can. And it's good to do that if you can see boring holes or something to get them off the site, and really thinking about following root disease protocols if you're in a root disease area and you're cutting trees. And I think that was mainly what I was going to say about fir engraver, that it's not there's not a whole lot thinning. Oh, I was going to say thinning trees for fir engraver. We still have more to learn about how effective that would be in this new scenario with the chronic droughts, because we don't have a stronger relationship with thinning and increased vigor as with pines, which is very strong. So we still say, I think that's still a good idea. It could buy you time with some of these other agents I talked about, that thinning would help a little bit, and that is still in our back pocket. So we're working on updated recommendations there. Acknowledgements I have on this slide, and just provide some information about our story maps for the region, about aerial survey and different insects and diseases we've mapped, and leaflets more about individual agents I talked about, and some of that heat dome I talked about, and that paper I just love about this subalpine fir range-wide decline analysis. And call Christina or myself if you have any questions, or some of the other regional office support in Region 6. And thank you.
All right, thank you, Laura. Boy, that is really a comprehensive view of what's happening with true fir, and realizing it's been a long-term, accumulation of issues, and of course, a lot of true fir growing in the landscape in more favorable times. I remember back 30 years ago when there was an outbreak of the spruce budworm that was really taking a lot of true fir out in eastern and central Oregon. And it kind of reset the ecosystems, and a lot of pine and larch and other more tolerant species were kind of emerging. So, the system did adjust back then, but now it looks like we're going through another big adjustment. I'm looking to see if there's any questions. And while I wait to see those pop up, I have some on my mind.
Okay.
And so I saw from the map that, there wasn't a lot of that mortality showing up nearly as much, in the northern Oregon Cascades or around the Willamette Valley. But I know just from my own observations, there is a fair amount of that. I think it's just more scattered. The fir engraver mortality on grand fir around the valley margin is pretty common and distinct. And of course, that's a warmer, drier kind of part of the, the system there west of the Cascades. And also a lot of the overgrown Christmas tree plantations that a lot of landowners have with grand fir and noble fir, especially. We're seeing engraver beetles take those out. But that seems, to be more of a scattered issue that doesn't show up as much on the aerial surveys, but it's something we're dealing with.
Oh, yes. I've heard the same from my colleagues that work in that area of Oregon, and even in Washington too. So that's a very good point. Yeah, the aerial survey really is picking up. It's these bigger areas of we do record smaller trees, but I think that some of that, depending on the time of the survey, could be a different year. We can't catch every single tree each year. So some of that we rely on folks like you, Glenn, and all the folks that are out in the forest to provide other information about what's happening with the dying fir.
Yeah, Laura, I might ask you, try turning your video on, see if we can see you, in case your internet will sustain that. Just be nice to see you if we could.
I know, I'm trying. It's not turning on.
Okay. I know we had it down because of your whatever was limiting you down there in the.
I'll have to send a little picture with the information after I send you after the talk. So at least you can know my face if you see me around. Yeah.
All right. Anybody have some questions for Laura?
Let's see.
You just covered it so well that there's nothing left, no stone left unturned.
I welcome any, if you think about it and have some questions later. I have really been working with the True First system, especially like I said, the subalpine zone for most of my career, and so it's very near and dear to my heart. So I know maybe I went too far, but I really feel like it's important topic to be aware of. And
yeah, no, I wouldn't say you went too far. It's just very, very thorough and even filled in some gaps for me for sure.
Wonderful.
Now, one of the things you mentioned about thinning, we're not sure how it might, help some of the trees survive, but I certainly observe a lot of these patches where there's a lot of tree fir mortality, but there are some individuals that seem to be getting through. And, often tell people, well, leave the healthier trees, you don't have to sacrifice them all if they're not dead yet. But there's then the question of, well, how important is it to sanitize or remove infested trees in an area, especially again, where the true fir is kind of clumped or scattered and not that widespread? How important is it to consider trying to remove dying trees to save green trees?
Yeah, what I can say is that I think I'm optimistic that this isn't this isn't a clear removal of all the true fir by any means, that there is enough genetic variability that some of these trees will be maintaining on the landscape for quite a long while. I mean, that's my dear hope. And we see the same issues we say the same things about the Doug fir dying down here too, that you see areas that are more reserves, like those better aspects, northwest or the wetter, cooler aspects, these little more concave areas, lower, maybe that are getting more moisture. Those will be our reserve areas in the future for sure, where we'll look for our different ability to retain the genetic variation we need to repopulate, or, so there's the adjustment, but I'm not recommending by any means to go cut everything down. No. I think we're just watching reset, and then we'll find answers to what are the best genetics available, to use for planting coming along pretty soon.
Yeah, and there's a question from Brandy up here in the North Willamette Valley. And we are still planting grand fir, and it is an important part of the ecosystem that we expect to persist, and we're not giving up on it. But are there microsites that are better than others for grand fir? Is there better potential in partial shade? And actually, on the other end, are there sites that are too wet or too much soil moisture? How do we decide, when it's too wet for grand fir? So there's several questions in one there.
Oh, I know, that is such a tricky one, where we're trying to think about that whole concept of a system migration, and there's experts or geneticists are much better able to answer that question than me. I just can speak to more of that. Paying attention to your microsites planted by nurse logs is always a good idea. Some shade, there are shade loving trees, so any help you can give them that way of picking your cooler slopes or your cooler aspects, and thinking about where you would think the water would stay at that moderate rate or whatever they're used to growing in the rest of your nearby area, like not making such giant changes, but thinking more of these microsites that are better. And then I'm sure we'll hear lots more in the future about seed lots that are being recommended and things too, that I don't just have at the tip of my fingers right now, but we can dig into that information if more coming up here too.
Here's an observation that Roger's seen grand fir tolerate standing water where Douglas fir doesn't like it in Northern Willamette Valley. And in general, we do think of grand fir as being more tolerant of wet soils. And then that question is, well, just how tolerant? But I think this question and the recommendation that we should just continue to manage a diversity of species. I don't think it's a good idea to just give up and not allow grand fir or to exclude it, or the true firs in general. We obviously have to be kind of hedging our bets and having multiple species. But it seems like, as you observed, Laura, that there's Engraver is going to keep coming and going, and it does come during times of better climate, but it's certainly going to persist, and there's a place for it. It makes it a little harder for us when we know that some trees are threatened, but it seems like diversity is still part of the solution.
Absolutely, Glenn. That's a very good point. Don't panic. We're expecting to retain some grand fir, and diversity of ages, size, size classes, species is always a good thing. That's the best thing.
Yeah, just about every site I see with dying true firs, I see persisting healthy specimens that are not dying, and so that's kind of a maybe evidence that that's a good idea to maintain some of that in the system and not to give up on it entirely.
Yes, I agree completely. Very good.
Any other questions or observations people want to share? Looks like there was something here. Why does the U.S. Forest Service mark its national forest boundaries by hatcheting tree sides? Oh yeah, so trees are chinked and then painted. So those are blazes, is another term for that. Why intentionally wound a mature tree is the question.
Well, yeah, in my experience, I haven't come across that as very often. I would think they would just be etching the outer bark, which wouldn't hurt the tree. If they're going into the wood, I've not really experienced that. I would hope they're not doing that.
Well, I would say blazing, as we call it, where you take a hatchet and you chop out about a 4-inch diamond on a tree, is sort of a standard way that foresters have marked, survey boundaries or site marker trees, or the way people mark boundaries along land, property boundaries. And It's not just the Forest Service; it's everybody does that. The general idea is if you have just like a 4-inch square taken out of a tree, that's minimal, and that's not considered a significant stress to a tree. That's the justification for it. And when we look at how big does a wound on a tree need to be before it's significant, we usually look at least a couple square feet of bark missing before we worry about it really affecting tree health. So I think that's the underlying justification. But we could probably avoid that, and we could use paint or flagging if we want to avoid taking a chance. Any other questions at this time? Well, if there are not any, we will make the recordings available, and certainly you've got contacts that Laura provided, and we'll be sending Sarah, you'll be sending emails out, I guess. And Sarah, do you have anything to add as our program organizer here?
No, that was great, Laura. Thank you. I learned a lot. And thanks everyone for your patience. Lots of hot computers that aren't cooperating in this heat today, but it was a great presentation, and Laura had some great resources. So I'll send everyone an email out tomorrow just with kind of a recap of those. Maybe we'll throw a picture of Laura in there so you'll recognize her if you see her out and about. But just, yeah, thank you all. And if you signed up for any of the other webinars in the series, you'll just keep hearing from me on the Wednesdays with a little reminder, but it's this exact same Zoom link, same time on Wednesdays. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks again. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. Appreciate it.
All right, try to stay cool.
All right, you as well. Have a good night.